This video is sponsored by an all-new product that you have to see to believe.
Sick and tired of your full battery? Say goodbye to that power with the Black Hole Battery Drainer, officially the world's fastest battery drainer. Compatible with any battery-powered device. 100 to 0% in under 15 seconds. Power goes in, but it won't come out. Guaranteed.
And boom, power's gone.
Yeah, awesome. Why would I want this?
Cool, now I can't use my phone at all.
Black Hole Battery Drainer. All your power gone. Get yours now at blackholepower.com.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Who would ever use this? The answer to that is no one, since the video is actually sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. We know you're tired of every RPG being a cutesy game full of candy, unicorns, and bright colors. It's time to get real, dark, epic, and awesome with Raid Shadow Legends. My favorite part of Raid are, well, the raids. I love building the perfect party to take into dungeons, like the Arcane Keep and the Fire Knight's Castle, where you face off against epic bosses that require unique strategies to take down. There's a ton happening in Raid this month, with new champions, updates to Tag Arena, and a full schedule of special tournaments and events, like the Deliana Chase event, where you can get a brand new legendary champion. Deliana is one of the strongest support champions in the entire game, and can help your team get past Raid's tougher challenges like those dungeon bosses. All you have to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and July 20th, and you'll get Deliana for free. That's it! This is the best time to get started in Raid. And if you click my link in the description or scan my QR code here, you'll get a free starter pack worth almost $40. That includes 3 champions, Mycericord, Tiger Soul, Romero, Tin Magic, Force, and Spirit XP Brews. All this treasure will be waiting for you here. But the gifts keep coming. Once you're in the game, enter promo code MYDELIANA to get your hands on everything, plus 50 XP Brews to instantly get Deliana to max level 50, as well as a ton of silver. So download Raid now and I'll see you in the game. On April 14, 2022, intelligence agents briefed the President of the United States that Russian President Vladimir Putin was considering the use of tactical nuclear weapons in his invasion of Ukraine. But what are tactical nukes, and why are they so much more dangerous than conventional nukes? And how in the world was a nuclear weapon meant to be powered by chickens? During World War II, the doctrine of strategic bombing came into its own. This called for the use of air power to deliver strategic strikes directly against an enemy's ability to wage war by targeting their industry, logistics centers, transport networks, and financial sectors. Military targets such as airfields, radar installations, shipyards, and submarine pens were also valid targets, but strategic bombing aimed to completely neutralize a nation's ability to continue supporting its war effort by demolishing the very infrastructure that made it possible to feed, arm, and transport troops. The problem was that bombing raids in World War II weren't very accurate, and the enemy could easily disperse their manufacturing industry over a wide area to avoid being destroyed, much like the Japanese did toward the end of the war. With the development of nuclear weapons, though, it was now possible to deliver bombs so powerful that accuracy was a distant second requirement to raw explosive power. With a single bomber able to carry multiple bombs each, it was now possible to completely neutralize a nation's ability to wage war from the air. The advent of intercontinental missiles only made this easier, and ever-increasing yields now made it possible to simply destroy entire cities, literally annihilating the enemy in genocidal attacks. Nuclear weapons were becoming so devastating so quickly that soon major powers like the United States and the Soviet Union realized that using them would only ensure their immediate destruction in a retaliatory attack. After all, neither side was likely to simply accept the complete destruction of a city housing 1 million or more people. Gripped by a certain Cold War nuclear madness, both the United States and the USSR turned to the development of lower-yield nuclear weapons, which they fantastically believed might pose a smaller risk of all-out thermonuclear war. These weapons were not meant to destroy entire cities, but rather to be used against military targets or transportation infrastructure, and often to be deployed in very close proximity to friendly forces. Soon they came to be known as tactical nuclear weapons, and both sides had their reasons for developing them other than simple deterrence. For the United States, an impetus to develop tactical nuclear weapons came from the fact that it was completely outgunned in conventional firepower by the Soviet bloc. Western European states fielded far more technologically advanced and better trained armies, but the Soviet bloc had its numbers on its side. To make matters worse, the NATO alliance relied heavily on the United States to make up the bulk of its firepower, and it would take weeks to transfer most of America's firepower to a European theater of war. This is where the United States turned to tactical nuclear weapons, developing numerous low or variable yield weapons which were meant to be employed against massed Warsaw Pact formations, especially in the very vulnerable Fulda Gap, where the First Battle of World War III would have been waged. These weapons were even assigned directly to frontline troops and meant to neutralize the advantage in numbers that the Soviets and their allies had over the West. However, gradually these weapons were removed from frontline duty as NATO forces began to achieve a level of parity in numbers against the Warsaw Pact, while greatly exceeding it in technological capability. By 1988, new British and American tanks were exponentially more effective than their Soviet counterparts, leading to a parity of power along Central Europe. The Soviet Union faced its own problems, which fueled its desire for tactical nuclear weapons. Its problems were not so much on the ground, but rather in the air. While the Soviets developed many highly capable fighters, NATO fighters were consistently ahead of the USSR's own, thanks to better avionics, weapons, and sensors. This made gaining control of the skies over an Eastern Europe battlefield difficult for the Soviet Union, and as World War II had proven, if you don't control the skies in Europe, victory is impossible. To counter NATO's superior air forces, the Soviet Union developed numerous tactical nuclear weapons, which could be used to penetrate deep behind enemy lines and destroy entire airfields at once. Conventional attacks could also achieve the same result, but NATO repair crews trained tirelessly to quickly repair the damage from cratering munitions, knowing that air superiority was the key to their victory. Within 48 hours at most, a thoroughly cratered airfield could at least be partially operational again. Tactical nuclear weapons ensured that this would not be the case, however, and made it easier for the Soviet Union to permanently neutralize NATO's all-important forward airfields. Without these, the Soviet Union would rule the skies, and no matter how advanced NATO tanks and other equipment was, subsequently own the ground as well. Both sides would end up fielding a lot of the same weapons for a lot of the same reasons. And much like strategic nuclear weapons had grown in number for the simple act of deterrence, soon the tactical arms race took off, with both sides building increasing numbers of tactical nuclear weapons, also for deterrence. If the enemy knew you had plenty of your own tactical nukes, they might not use theirs after all. Tactical nuclear weapons were almost immediately controversial, as it was at least thought that by limiting their yield and only hitting military targets, they might be acceptable to use in case of a war. This was likely extremely foolish thinking, as the widespread use of tactical nuclear weapons would inevitably lead to the military collapse on one side. On the verge of an overwhelming defeat, the loser would inevitably turn to strategic nuclear weapons, encouraged not only by the desire to avoid catastrophic defeat, but also by the fact that the nuclear threshold had already been so severely lowered. But perhaps the biggest danger from strategic nuclear weapons was that they could spark a global nuclear war with very little provocation. As mentioned earlier, strategic nuclear weapons were often supplied directly to frontline troops, and on multiple occasions across both NATO and the Soviet Union's history, their use was left up to the discretion of local commanders. Normally, the use of a strategic nuclear weapon requires authorization from the very top of their respective governments. In the United States, only the president could authorize the release of nuclear weapons, and in the Soviet Union, only the general secretary could do the same. This builds in a long line of accountability and fail-safes meant to prevent accidental nuclear exchange or from an over-anxious general ordering nuclear Armageddon. Tactical nuclear weapons, however, often don't have the same level of oversight because they would need to be used quickly in response to sudden enemy aggression. They not only had to be stationed close to the front lines, but their authority to fire was down to local commanders. This put the decision to potentially start a full-scale nuclear exchange in the hands of a single individual, sometimes as low-ranking as a colonel, a dangerous circumstance for both sides of the Cold War. However, if you think that the threat is a relic of the past, think again, because now, as India and Pakistan stare down the barrel of yet another war against each other, it's once more feared that Pakistan will leave authority to use nuclear weapons on its battlefield to its commanders. With Indian forces vastly superior to those of Pakistan, and with a doctrine of fighting a deep penetration opening assault to push as deep as possible into Pakistan, it's feared that panicking Pakistani commanders will authorize the use of nuclear weapons to stop Indian assaults, even if they're nuking their own territory. Now, though, the specter of tactical nuclear weapons has returned to Europe, as U.S. intelligence, which has so far completely nailed every move and decision Russia has made in its invasion of Ukraine, warns that Russian President Putin is so frustrated by the botched invasion of its neighbor that he may use low-yield tactical nuclear weapons soon, with Vladimir Putin fearing that the lack of military success, coupled with extreme casualties suffered so far, will cause him to rapidly lose domestic support. The pressure is on to deliver the Russian people a victory in Ukraine, as his conventional forces struggle to defeat Ukraine's much smaller forces. The only way to rapidly secure a decisive victory is to use weapons of mass destruction, and Vladimir Putin might be gambling that the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons will allow him to achieve his objectives without prompting a retaliatory response from the West. But the types of weapons available and the forms they have taken throughout history may just surprise you. During the Cold War, both sides did everything they could to try to track each other's ballistic missile submarine fleet. This silent fleet of ballistic missile subs carried enough nuclear firepower to level every major city in Europe and the United States, and neutralizing them quickly and efficiently in case of war was of the utmost priority. The US had a huge advantage in tracking Soviet submarines. Their SOSUS underwater tracking system spanned around the world and used acoustic features of the ocean that the Soviet Union was largely unaware of to effectively track even the quietest Soviet subs. It was said that for the majority of the Cold War, there was rarely ever a Soviet submarine that didn't have a US tail on it the moment it left its home port. However, the effectiveness of the SOSUS network and other tracking technologies gradually diminished due to the advances in Soviet submarine design and the leaking of classified intelligence on these tracking systems to the Soviet Union. But tracking an enemy submarine is different from targeting it, and conventional explosives required a direct or near-direct hit to effectively cripple an enemy submarine. In 1982, the US Navy decided, screw it. If we can't guarantee a hit, let's just blow up the entire ocean. To that end, they tasked Boeing with developing a nuclear anti-submarine warfare torpedo named the Sea Lance. The Sea Lance was housed inside a watertight capsule, which was launched from a torpedo tube either on board a submarine or a surface vessel. The capsule then floated to the surface and a rocket would ignite as its fins deployed. An inertial guidance system directed the missile to the general area of the enemy target, after which the payload separated, deployed a parachute to slow its fall down, and then sink to a predetermined depth. Then, a W-89 thermonuclear bomb would explode, destroying any submarine in a 6.2-mile radius. The program was eventually canceled thanks to the fall of the Soviet Union, and sea life everywhere breathed a collective sigh of relief. The kill everything and let God sort them out attitude of defense had begun long in advance to the age of the Sea Lance, though, with the advent of the Nike Hercules, the air defense missile in 1958. The Nike Hercules was an upgrade to the MIM-3 Nike Ajax, and followed the same line of thinking. If you could kill everything in the sky, then accuracy didn't really matter. The weapon was designed primarily for destroying entire formations of supersonic jet aircraft, but could also be used for missile defense thanks to the massive nuclear explosion it generated upon detonation. It could also be used in a surface-to-surface mode, allowing it to strike land targets as well. The Nike Hercules would be the last American nuclear-armed surface-to-air missile, and was replaced with the Patriot missile defense system, which featured such increased accuracy that the nuclear warhead was no longer necessary. Interceptor planes would get their own nuclear air-to-air missiles as well, though. In 1957, the U.S. Air Force developed the Air-2A Genie, a nuclear air-to-air rocket out of fear of mass formations of Soviet bombers penetrating into the American heartland. In 1947, the Soviet Union had successfully reverse-engineered a copy of the B-29 Superfortress after seizing one during a war, and now they had a plane capable of reaching the United States in a one-way suicidal attack against American cities. Guns and cannons were not sufficient to fend off large formations of enemy jet bombers, and air-to-air missiles were still relatively crude and unreliable. Thus, the U.S. Air Force turned to the tried-and-true method of simply blowing everything up. The Genie was meant to be launched from an intercepting aircraft into the heart of the Soviet formation, annihilating multiple aircraft at once. The advantage of the weapon was that it detonated so high up in the atmosphere that it was considered safe for use even over populated areas. To prove a point, 5 U.S. Air Force officers volunteered to stand unprotected directly under the only live fire of a Genie weapon in the Yucca Flats test range. The weapon exploded some 18,500 to 20,000 feet over their heads, and the 5 men received very negligible doses of radiation. Only air crews assigned to fly directly through the blast cloud 10 minutes after detonation received any significant dose of radiation. During most of the Cold War, the greatest threat to the U.S. Army was the vast hordes of Soviet tanks waiting for them in Eastern Europe. To neutralize the numbers advantage, the U.S. developed the Davy Crockett recoilless rifle. Beginning production in 1958, a grand total of 2,100 were made and delivered to the U.S. Army. The weapon could not only be carried by frontline troops, but an air-deployable version was even made for the airborne infantry, allowing them to drop behind enemy lines, carrying tactical nuclear weapons. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the weapon was that it didn't kill by blast, but rather by radiation. Troops within 520 feet would die almost instantly from the neutron radiation produced by the weapon, with troops further away dying in hours, days, or within 2 weeks depending on the distance and shielding. The weapon would actually do very little damage to enemy vehicles unless they were directly at the detonation point, allowing those vehicles to later be recovered, decontaminated, and pressed back into service. The weapon was eventually removed from service in the late 1960s due to it being a danger to its own troops. troops, and the fact that despite assurances to its accuracy, the weapon proved to be wildly inaccurate, even for the delivery of nuclear weapons, which tend not to care too much about accuracy. Despite these shortcomings, West German Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss begged the United States for large amounts of the weapon, claiming that one single weapon could replace 40 to 50 salvos of an entire unit of divisional artillery in defense of Germany from Soviet attacks. The United States declined to provide the weapons, though, as it would have left West Germany incapable of defense without resorting to the use of nuclear weapons, immediately escalating any conflict into a nuclear exchange. During the late 1940s and all through the 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union both had nuclear fever and sought to develop nuclear variants of any weapon conceivable. The US created the atomic cannon, or the Atomic Annie as it was known. Atomic Annie was basically just a scaled-up howitzer shell in the 280mm range that was fired out of a howitzer inspired by the German K5 railroad gun. The gun itself was transported by two specially designed tractors and could be set up and ready to fire in just 12 minutes. On May 25, 1953 at 8:30 a.m., the first and only nuclear shell ever to be fired from a cannon resulted in the successful detonation of a 15-kiloton warhead. After the successful test, an order was placed for 20 cannons, with their immediate deployment to South Korea and Europe. However, by the time of its deployment, it was already obsolete, as by then, the tactical nuclear missiles were already being provided to U.S. forces. Nevertheless, the weapon was kept around until 1963. In 1957, Britain joined the crazy train with the acquisition of the Blue Peacock weapon system, a nuclear landmine. The weapon weighed a whopping 7.2 tons and was meant to be buried on the North German plain and left completely unattended. The bomb would then be remotely detonated via a connecting wire that ran for miles, or simply be set to an 8-day timer. The purpose of the mine wasn't to immediately stop enemy troops, but rather to allow them to move over an area and even fortify it, only to have the nuclear landmines explode from below. If detected, each landmine had anti-tamper devices which would arm the mine and detonate it within a minute. To detect tampering, the casing was pressurized, and with any loss of pressure, it immediately armed the weapon. Tilt sensors and flooding sensors would also arm the weapon if they detected water or that weapon was being moved. The weapon would have been devastating, as it would have irradiated large swaths of enemy-held territory, making holding it impossible. However, a glaring flaw was soon discovered, and the fix was chickens? If buried underground during the winter, the components could get very cold, causing the electronics to no longer work. The British investigated ways of keeping the components warm, such as wrapping the bombs in insulating blankets, but an alternative was soon suggested. Live chickens would be sealed inside the casing with sufficient food, water, and breathable air for about a week or so. Their combined body warmth would keep the electronics warm and the weapon active. After a week, it's supposed that the weapon would simply be dug up and the chickens replaced. It was believed upon discovery of the declassified Blue Peacock file on April 1, 2004, that this had been an April Fool's joke, to which the head of education and interpretation of the National Archives, Tom O'Leary, replied that the civil service does not do jokes. In an alternate Earth, chicken-powered nuclear landmines helped stop a Soviet invasion, but in our timeline, the weapon was very quickly decommissioned when it was realized that purposefully preparing to detonate a friendly ally's territory with a nuclear booby trap was not a viable political position to hold. Since it's now more likely to happen than ever, go check out What If There Was a Nuclear War Between the US and Russia, or click this other video instead.